Joining me from New York, it's a pleasure, Jane Ferguson. She is founder and CEO of Newsphere. It's a new app based monetization platform for journalists to go straight to their viewers, their subscribers, their readers. She has covered herself in glory as a special correspondent at the PBS NewsHour. I've seen her byline in the New Yorker. Her book was just, it just left with me. All of these things that you've done traveling the world, literally dodging bullets. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. I'm a little hot, but yeah, I'm just coming to you from downtown Manhattan, so nowhere terribly exciting.
But you are now covering yourself in glory as a media executive. And I saw that you had this idea for Newsphere while you were as an entrepreneur in residence at Princeton, the old alma mater. Would you explain that?
Well, I was technically a Ferris professor, one of those visiting professors that they do, where they effectively allow or invite journalists to come in and be professors full time, but for one semester, and you get to design a course, and they ask you to basically design it and teach it. Fall 2023, that was me. But I had already really had the idea for Newsphere. I knew, I'd been living through the reality of the economic collapse of our industry. And I had been searching for solutions to the question, can that happen, but the journalists keep working? Could we save the journalism if we can't save the institutions? And I'd spent time in New York around people in tech with very big brains, and then I got to Princeton around people with even bigger brains, and I was lucky enough to be welcomed in by some of the sort of academic institutions around entrepreneurship there. They actually told me on day one, they were like, when you teach here, you can take any course you want, which is pretty amazing. It's a much fancier university than I went to. So I went off to the entrepreneurship department and explained to them what I wanted to do, and they let me take the classes in venture capital and how to raise funds and how to start a company, and really started mentoring me through there. So I was just an incredible amount of grace and luck that I ended up in the right place at the right time as an entrepreneur.
So obviously, there's a seismic event right now, almost like an asteroidal type event going on. If I were to timestamp this for our listeners and viewers, the Senate is about to debate, defunding, the rescission of funding for public broadcasting. That's ours is an NPR member station show. We both have done NewsHour. I still do NewsHour on occasion. This would really disproportionately hit the smaller member stations that are dependent on matching funds from the government to keep whatever the trains running on time, the broadcast running on time. For profit media, I don't have to explain for our listeners. Look at CNN being spun off from Warner Brothers Discovery. Look at the breakup of MSNBC and NBC. Look at the parlous state of CBS News right now with the Paramount sale. What is 60 Minutes going to look like had a staff mutiny there? And I don't have to tell you about newspapers, the massive die out that's been going on now for a good quarter century. And maybe one or two players, the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, can stand on its feet as a kind of a for profit. But I'm not convinced, and a lot of our sources in cold eyed investing are not convinced that journalism by itself is a compelling business.
Oh man, I mean, I'm in the trenches of trying to win that argument. Like it is, you say the words journalism in a meeting with a venture capitalist, and they might just throw up in their mouth a little bit. So you really have to be very careful about like explaining to them the difference between the business models of the past and now. This is the argument to be made, and it's one I believe in fundamentally. The business models of all the organizations you've just described no longer work, and they won't work. I don't believe they're fixable. But the demand for news is higher than ever. I think we in broadcasting have been telling ourselves for years, oh, maybe people just aren't interested in serious journalism. That's not true. The New York Times proves it. The explosion of independent reporting proves it, and independent reporting people will pay for. Thankfully, while that sort of collapse was happening, and it was relatively sort of a slow moving car crash for a while, and now it's really sped up. While that was happening, technology changed a lot of things. I was struck when I was in Afghanistan when Kabul fell to the Taliban. Now, of course, this was 2021, a long time ago now, but at the time, I was there for PBS and the New Yorker, and I found myself by pure chance, I stayed All the networks pulled everybody out of the US networks, and the Brits stayed. And they were worried about security. And what I noticed throughout the 10 days that followed of the disastrous, attempts to evacuate Afghans, the attempts to flee the city, it was such a catastrophic situation at the airport. I'm covering it every night on PBS NewsHour. And that's obviously drawing quite a big crowd, but it's my social media that's exploding. And at one stage, some of those videos were being like ripped off and aired on CNN. And it was fascinating to me because, then there was this sort of very, fairly good natured back and forth of like, hey, if you're going to air my videos, you have to credit them and let viewers know I'm on assignment for PBS. But it was the first time in my whole career that they needed me more than I needed them in terms of a
Mm.
news organization to journalist. And that's simply because I had a phone and an internet connection. And it seems like a naive thing to say in 2025, but in 2021, that rocked my world. We used to spend thousands of dollars per minute to go live from a rooftop in Kabul because we needed a satellite, So yes, the business model no longer works, but there are solutions that make doing our jobs a lot cheaper, which saves on that margin. And so it's really about distribution models now rather than saying journalism is finished.
So give me blank slate. You right now find out there's an incredible once in a lifetime story at the Golan Heights. That's Syria's in conflagration again.
Mhm.
In a past life, somebody like the New Yorker would be spending for your security, your flak jacket, your flight over the secured hotel. I mean, you'd have to,
I've
it,
been a
especially as
freelancer
an
a long
Irish or
time.
European kind of, there had to be some hustle and you had to compel somebody. I don't know, Vanity Fair back in the day, maybe they would have done it.
Totally.
Maybe David Remnick still does it. Is there any way for you to say, I have my phone, I have my cardioid mic, I have a sat
Mhm.
connection or connection to Elon Musk's network, and I'm going to give you the story of a lifetime. I'm just going to do it on my own, on spec. I'm not convinced that there is any, it's not like you're going to have a tip jar out there with people crowdfunding
No,
your trip.
but this is here. Here's the reality. Yes, in the past, you would have already spent years building connections with commissioning editors. They would know you. You'd be either formal or informal string. So you'd be stringer calling them up, being like, yep, I can get out there. Someone would commission you. They might say, fine, we'll commission this set of, they might just do a per piece rate or they might do a day rate. They'll cover your costs. But the reality is, and this is where I think things were a little bit unique for me. Um, uh, Partly out of the fact that I was freelance for so long, that had already started to go away. Like well-paid commissions, private security. I mean, absolutely not. Hotels, flights, things like that were already starting to get squeezed, and the truly competitive freelancers were ones who were already there. Um, so the more independent you were, the more you could run yourself like a business, the more sustainable it was that you would get these assignments anyway. That's how I spent a lot of my career. But the reality is that now, if you have a loyal subscriber base, if you have an independent income, you absolutely can get to the Golan Heights and cover that story and cover it well. A lot, but you're going to have to run yourself like a small media company. You front the costs to get there, and then you do that based on the fact that you're assuming that you're serving your audience well. It's no different from you being a one person CNN. And so I absolutely believe this is the future, 100%. However, the journalist who's flying in from abroad is still at a disadvantage from the incredibly talented local journalist who's based there, who perhaps also speaks English, who may have access to an American audience too. That's leveling the playing field, frankly, a little bit. So it really depends on how big your audience is and whether or not you can make it work financially to then get on a plane and get there. Or are you someone who's so dedicated to this story you already live in Jerusalem or you already live in Damascus?
This is fascinating. I think back to I covered emerging markets for Business Week. I went to sub-Saharan Africa in 2007, was it, or 2008? And yet places that did not have landline, did not have sewerage or potable water, had cell phones. And
Yeah.
you remember the old brick Nokia phone, and there was banking
Oh
that
yeah.
was made possible. You didn't have to carry cash on payday. So it's like you made this great leap forward in all
Hmm.
of these countries in the global south that suddenly you could have mobile banking. You could have mobile access, and now
Amazing.
we take for granted that you could go to Lagos and fire up an iPhone on a Wi-Fi, or obviously in Iran, obviously in North Tehran, even in Afghanistan, even in Kabul, even in
Actually,
Syria,
especially in
and yeah,
Afghanistan, the cell service in Afghanistan is better than in Northern Ireland, where I grew up.
and that's
Um,
just an 18-year-old. I mean, the smartphone effectively was introduced in 2007. And now that that's ubiquitous and people forget, and I like to slow it down for our listeners sometimes, you have a high powered camcorder, camera, recorder, compass, everything just in the palm of your hand.
100%. And it's funny you mentioned, like, the money transfers and this incredibly high quality phone reception. I spent a lot of time over the years in Somalia. Somalia has some of the cheapest, best cell service. And I remember at the time flying into Mogadishu and having my little Nokia brick, which would, the battery would last for about 7 days. And I remember buying scratch cards to add, and the best I could get was $1 per scratch card. And I bought this massive ream of them, thinking, oh, this is going to take me forever. And I put in like $25 worth of cash, and it was extraordinary. Like, it lasted me forever. I was able to, keep, even when I moved up to a smartphone, you could still have Life 360 and all of these sort of
Oh,
apps working on your phone. And you're in the back of an armored vehicle with African Union soldiers way out of town. And that is an incredible resource for brilliant local journalists too. I mean, they have access to the world now because of that. And so they just don't have the infrastructure to reach that audience. And that's what we're trying to build here.
and it's interesting you talk about kind of legacy imitating new, right? We've seen this on ESPN. I don't want to get into wonky stuff, but something like the Pat McAfee show is a guy who was straight to YouTube. That ESPN
Mhm.
realized he had such a demographic, he was so off the cuff that they had to go and license YouTube back to the cable channel, right? You're going to see this happen, right?
Well, we're already seeing it.
As
Like,
the
yeah,
lines blur more between kind of linear news and digital news. Would you comment on that?
sure. I mean, like, I think that when you look at what happened with Red Seat, and the podcasters that have now basically been pulled back into the News Corps
Well, tell
world,
us
like
about Red Seed. Tell us about Red Seed for a minute for our
sorry. So,
listeners.
so,
Yeah.
so my basic understanding of it, and correct me if I'm wrong, is, I mean, you have a lot of talent who have come out from the Fox News world, whether that's Megyn Kelly or Tucker Carlson, or people like Pierce Morgan. Many of them came out with their own podcasts and their own shows, and it went independent, whether that's on YouTube
Hmm.
or across the podcast world. And I mean, the podcast company that effectively helps that hosts many of them, and is their
Oh, Red Seed.
infrastructure, exactly, has now been purchased or partnered with the essentially the Murdoch empire back
Wow.
again. So full circle, and a recognition that, like, essentially this talent thrived outside of the original home. And I think that, though, that also one thing that's also been proved, when people leave the legacy media organizations and start their own work, that I think is really important, is that the change in technology now means that we can really produce very high quality content much more cheaply. You don't need a network to film a beautiful TV show. And that's something that, like, I have really been focused on with the Chuck Todd show, for instance, on a
Yeah,
Sunday night.
we'll get into that. I've been blown away by how glossy that looks. I've seen the videos on LinkedIn.
Well, thank you. But, I mean, you know what I'm talking about. I come from a PBS background, and we collaborated with those who had worked on the Charlie Rose show. Like, where the sweet spot is now is you have to deliver something of quality, but you don't have to deliver something from a very cheesy network studio. We're now, we should not have to choose
It
between
might be cheesy, but it's an expensive network studio with unionized staff
100%.
and some old analog equipment. It looks like those moving cameras and the guy behind it, and
Totally.
timesheets and hour cards. I mean, they're more than vestiges of yesteryear's peak linear media.
They are. But at the same time, I'm also a little tired of watching people yell into their laptops from their basements on other places, like Substack and YouTube. Like,
Sorry, all
we
we
can
have is Riverside, madam, here, but but I have a face for radio. Um,
that's That's
I'm trying to figure out a better mousetrap because there are people who are just barking into a phone. And I guess in defense of that, there are a lot of people out there who find that rustically chopped and authentic. I don't want to throw authentic around, but that is Farzad unplugged.
this is different because this is podcasting, but like looking at like people who are doing TV interviews, I think we got way too stuck in the COVID era of zooming rather than like if both those people are in New York City or in Washington DC, the ability to go and sit down together is not really something people I think lean into as much anymore. And I think that face-to-face interaction is really important.
Still, I have to say, Jane, the likes of Tucker Carlson and Megyn Kelly, and maybe they went a little more feral after their misadventures and kind of legacy cable news. I mean, Tucker Carlson was, my impression was he was a blood offering after the election settlement fiasco at Fox News. Megyn Kelly didn't work out for her at NBC News and the Today
Right.
Show, and she went off. It's great. They have what we call an investing portable alpha. You can take that out there, and there's a captive subscriber base, but they're not making anywhere near what they made 5 years ago.
Well, I don't know that that's true.
You still have a Fox News that's so flush. Arguably, it's never done better, even actuarially with its old subscribers. The ad money keeps coming in. Linear is still a profit center. It is for CNN as well, and
Yes.
that's what they're using, even if it's melting, to
And,
subsidize these expensive news forays.
and that's actually part of the problem. The problem is that it's still profitable, although their margins are shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, which prevents them from basically going to the extremes they need to completely reorient,
Oh,
effectively.
self disruption, as you know, in entrepreneurship is really difficult. It's why we're not carrying a Microsoft smartphone. You
Right.
know, uh,
It's it is it's very difficult. But I would say though, to your point about how they're not making as much, that might be true of someone who makes 25 million a year at a network or even more. But for someone who makes 2 to 4, which is those bigger names at the cable networks, that's more within the ballpark now of what people are making. And for the broadcaster, that provides a real danger. If someone who's making, let's say we're assuming they're making 3, 4, 5 a year, and they're a household name, they're very, very famous, there's a fair chance they could make it out in the independent world and make just as much money, and be their own boss and be able to shape the kind of work that they want to do. That's a very vulnerable place for a news organization to be. How do they handle that ability for the talent to walk away?
Full disclosure, I'm Roben Farzad. Our guest is Jane Ferguson, veteran foreign correspondent, has been on some of the hairiest um, datelines and bylines. I mean, think about it: Somalia, Afghanistan. You've been to Iran, my homeland.
I have not,
We
unfortunately.
have to we have to get you there. I mean, I wonder if you have a joint Irish-U.S. passport.
I do. I have Irish and British passports,
Those
and
are
I
golden
know that it would be
passports.
easier for me with an Irish passport, but and so unfortunately, I've never been.
Well, you are founder and CEO of Newsphere. You're a veteran journalist correspondent turned uh, media mogul, if you will, or incipient media mogul. Newsphere is a monetization platform and app for journalists who want to go straight to subscribers to cut out the middleman at the time of rapidly disrupting legacy journalism. We don't have to explain that your timing is perfect. If this thing launched in Q1 2025, there's a out of necessity and disruption, there's just this mass secession movement in legacy journalism. I want to take the example of Chuck Todd, who, just a few years ago hosted Meet the Press. He worked up the system. He was, in that shadow of Tim Russert initially, was a person that you associated with Sunday mornings on the television. And then you was going, straight to digital, or you'd see him brought into MSNBC. And now the parent, Comcast Cabletown, is crushing all of that. And they're looking at costs. And NBC is, as you know, is trying to stand up for the correspondence that it wants to take in the divorce, and MSNBC is taking your own. Chuck Todd is precisely that kind of person, and I would also think his counterpart, Steve Kornacki, they're the ones who could go out into the world of Substack or Newsphere or whatever it is and cut out the middleman.
Yes, absolutely, and it's a huge vulnerability for news organizations. Now, the reality is that if you're at a news organization, even if you're a really, really huge name, it's a very vulnerable place to be, to have one revenue stream, one job that you could lose at any moment. So I think a lot of people are thinking to themselves, who are in that position, do I need to start building my own community, my own paying subscribers somewhere? Is there a way even to do both? Like, could I have a show on legacy media and also build, my own podcast over
Doesn't the
here?
mothership pull you back in though if you veer a little too far? I've seen some contemporaries. Steve Inskeep at NPR has a Substack channel, right?
Right.
It's more of a kind of a hobbyist thing right now. He's not out there like Oliver Darcy or others. I don't remember the platform that he's on. On that hamster wheel, 13 hours a day.
Yeah, it is. It's essentially a conundrum for the networks. Do they negotiate and try to be more flexible, or do they really double down and say, no, like effectively we own you and your work and your name and your face, which puts a correspondent in a precarious situation. I mean, they're thinking, if they're smart, they're thinking, well, where am I in 3 years? Where am I in 5 years? So a lot of it depends on where you are in your career. And also, like you say, I think part of the challenge is, what does a correspondent or an anchor or a journalist want from their career? Do they want to be independent? Not everybody who has worked as a staff journalist at a news organization wants to be a content creator. I know we hate the phrase. We'll try to think of a better one. But effectively, what that means is, do they want to work these kinds of hours, promote their own work, do all of the marketing? It's an extraordinarily heavy lift. Content creators are some of the hardest working people on the planet. It is relentless to be, to build and keep subscribers. So so that's something that I think a lot of people are mindful of too.
Have you seen the movie Goodfellas, Jane?
Of course.
That great scene with Paul Sorvino at the mob cookout, and he's eating a hot dog, and it's in slow motion, and the narrator, the late actor who played Henry Hill, is saying this is what it's all about: protection money. I think about it atavistically: why we have tribes, why we hunt in packs, why we want to be in an organization, because it's a mutualization of input and output. You get
Hmm.
insurance, you get back office, you get all these other things. Some tipping point happened, whether it was cord cutting or whatever it was, that kind of, that's not as compelling anymore. It's not as protective. Your agent can't save you. I don't know if I'm mixing concepts here, but it's the way my metaphorical mind works.
Sure.
And you might as well say, you know what, in this insecurity and the amount of work that I have to put into it versus the amount of overhead and protection I'm getting, especially if I have savings, why not make the leap?
Yes, and I think one thing that's really, you're right. Whenever you, first of all, you're talking about being in an institution, it feels like,
Yeah, I mean, why do we invest in portfolios? Why do we invest in indices? Why are we at companies? There's this kind of this, you know, atavistically, if we're a bunch of higher order apes like chasing after a side of gazelle, right? And then divvying that up, like there's risk reward in that. We help. There's a division of labor,
and
and there's
also there's prestige. I mean, it's just extraordinary how much people do care about having the, I'm a correspondent for, dot dot dot. There's a certain taboo for a long
does an Andrew
time.
Ross Sorkin care anymore? Does an Ezra Klein? There are
No,
certain people who have transcended the importance of those brands, and
100%. Yes. But there's also a tier of hugely important journalists who are not as famous as that, but who have a loyal following. And that's the thing, is that I think one thing that the subscription model proved was that you don't need millions and millions of viewers. You need, 10,000 or even 1,000 incredibly loyal viewers who will pay you a monthly income. Like, you don't need to be a viral sensation to make a good living as an independent reporter. I think one thing that really happened over COVID and since, as people have gone out into independent platforms, it's taken the taboo off it. It doesn't feel as much of a failure to be an independent reporter, but actually be very successful. And I think that has blurred the lines between saying, well, I am the CNN White House correspondent, as opposed to saying, well, I am Jane Ferguson and I have a very successful platform of my own. Or, things like that. Like, people are, that it's taking the taboo away from some of the slightly bruised egos that have emerged from this battered industry.
full disclosure, please do stay with us. This show podcast to NPR, Spotify, Apple, YouTube. For as awful as that presence looks right now, I'm trying to build it. Trust me, stay with me. Follow us on all social media at handle Roben Farzad. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Facebook. We are
Soon to
on
be
Blue
on
Sky.
Newsphere.
On Newsphere, please, if you would
Breaking
take
here.
me. Yeah, you could take me on Newsphere, according to Jane Ferguson. And a shout out to our listeners on Radio IQ, Virginia's public news colossus, public media colossus. You can find all of these links at fulldradio.com. Again, fulldradio.com. Shout it to your mother in law, your girlfriend, your barber, and my DMs are always open for you. If you're just joining us, my esteemed guest is Jane Ferguson. I've seen her byline. Gosh, some of the stuff you've written in the New Yorker and the NewYorker.com just is one of those things that we have driveway moments in the NPR world that just magazine pieces you didn't want to put down because you did such a good job of transporting us to places that we will never visit. You are founder and CEO of Newsphere. It's this new app-based monetization platform for journalists. I've seen some of these Chuck Todd Newsphere videos. I think that interview with Rahm Emanuel, which was super glossy. I mean, it looks like a 10K presentation. Certainly, we were never shooting in 10K in PBS.
No, but one thing PBS proved was that you can create great TV on smaller budgets. I mean, I probably shouldn't say this on the air, but we used to joke at the foreign news department at the news hour that our international news budget was probably the same as David Muir's Hairspray budget. So, we pulled off miracles. We competed with 60 Minutes, on a shoestring. So there's a pedigree of public broadcasters out there who I would argue are well prepared for this era.
Will you take us back to your aha moment in Princeton when this idea came about and you realize all of this disruption and fear and loathing going on in your industry? And was it at a cafe? Was it at the faculty house? Were you, I mean, bickering and eating club? I don't know. Tell me.
I think it is incredibly helpful to get out of the bubble of journalism. I lived and breathed in the tribe my whole career, living in Dubai and Yemen and Afghanistan and Beirut eventually. Like, we all live within the industry and we're so myopic. We only see our own industry and its crisis from the inside. And spending time at Princeton, I was taking venture capital classes, like, how to become a venture capitalist or how to raise venture capital. And it was just so extraordinary to see what it really is to build a disruptive company, to really understand and look under the hood of how you can look at a problem from a completely new angle. And it was really in those classes at Princeton where I was just this sort of ancient old broad who was sort of sitting in there amongst a bunch of 19, 20-year olds.
Isn't there a
And
better Irish word for broad? Maybe you can upscale that for us.
maybe we can upscale, sort of, I guess, lass.
Yes. Okay,
You
go
know,
ahead.
older lass sitting among these youngsters, taking notes. Um, and actually, for the first time in my career, feeling very excited about the future, not just thinking, oh, we're kind of limping from one crisis to another. I thought, what would it be like to be in an industry that's ascendant? Um, and I was lucky enough to spend time around people who were at CNN and MTV in 1980, like a seminal moment in media where no one believed the disruption that was going to be caused. Like, who the hell would want to watch news all day long? And who the hell would want to watch a band just playing music,
I
And
would right now in 2025, but I can't because MTV doesn't really exist.
exactly. But in 1980, these were revolutionary moments. And so it was really sitting in classes with people who were, a lot less beat down and exhausted and perhaps, cynical, looking at disruptive tech and thinking, this is actually very exciting because what we do as journalists has value. The problem is the systems around it. And that can be fixed.
When did it have value? And I don't mean to wax too nostalgic for a bygone era, but it was always cross subsidized by full page advertising or, the monopolistic margins of local newspapers and the protection they got from being able to own the TV station and the like. It feels like when in our lives were we truly asked to pay for news at a fully loaded basis? Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do. I understand that like the construct around it wasn't a clear exchange of goods. That was more complex than that. But the reality was the eyeballs that came in because of people's desire to know what was going on. So if you had a monopoly over that, if you had a show that people wanted to watch, if you had information that added to your brand as a newspaper company or as a broadcast show that still added value to what you were as a company. Effectively, people associated you with the ability to
But it
learn
was it was
what's going
always
on.
advertising or pledge drives that kind of greased that. To my mind, it was never really a circulation thing like, wow, that news gathering is so amazing. I mean, you might look at Graydon Carter's latest book on his adventures at Vanity Fair. That was always subsidized by this perception of luxury and getting celebs in high couture brands. And then the ulterior motive was in great investigative pieces, and you'd pay people $2 a word, right? There
Sure,
was always largesse. It was never, and again, like, I mean, could you say Netflix right now is that? You know, you have to pry Netflix logins from somebody's cold dead hands, but you're being asked to pay $17 a month. Or the New York Times, you're being asked to pay however
sure.
much it is every month. But very, very few and rare examples of this.
Well, I think throughout history there haven't been that few and rare. I mean, there have been profitable papers. There's been, the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. I mean, there have been news organizations that have been profitable because people do want to know what's going on. Yes, they've built different business models around them, ad revenue. They've had the catnip of celebrity news. Now, of course, today it's games and cooking and things like that. But ultimately, the news is still part of the value add to the bundle. I think part of the problem is, yes, information is free in a lot of places, and so there's just so much leeching of it as a product. But ultimately, the fact, like, would I pay for the New York Times if it didn't have news? Probably not. And yet, every time I let my subscription lapse, it's always a recipe that pulls me back in. Um, but I wouldn't pay for it if it didn't have news.
That was a really difficult 3 point turn, and I hope to have Meredith Kopit Levien on the show soon to discuss that. You know, there was the Trump bump and various other things that made people realize this is essential. This is, if I'm breaking up my media budget, time was what I'd spend 150, $160 a month on cable. This much needs to go to Spotify. This much goes to the New York Times. This much goes to, I don't even know anybody that does PBS Passport. Sadly, that's a whole other
Mm.
conversation. But if you're out there, and this brings up the topic of Substack. We've had
Mhm.
Substackers out there. There's some people who do it brilliantly well, and especially from a B2B perspective. Some bond coverage people, some people that are not necessarily journalism, but you like their coverage so much that you're going to become a paying subscriber to that Substack. And Substack seems to be the benchmark for this out there. It's almost become a verb. He's gone Substack. To what
Mhm.
extent were you confronted with that when you were pitching your idea, maybe looking for investors, and they're saying, why are you building a different wheel? We already have Substack.
Sure. Actually, I would say that the Substack model proves a lot of what we were building, which was that we now know, thanks to the research, that 16, sorry, 60% of 16 to 40-year-olds in the United States already pay for or donate to news in some format. Gen Z and millennial want to pay for news. It's actually higher than 60% for millennials because it's averaged out with the Gen Zs. But of those, they are twice as likely to pay for it from an individual they know and trust than from a news brand. So we know that news brands are not really trusted or valued by younger consumers. And I'm really talking about people in their early 40s and through their 30s as well. So we know that there's this different consumer behavior. They want to be able to pay directly to that creator. We've seen that with other journalists, some of them making money on Patreon, where there are people who want to support them and are happy to pay. I think one of the things so Substack was very early into this model, but it wasn't really designed for journalism in the sense that all of the journalists who are on Substack are now siloed. So they're now having to compete for the same $5, $6 a month. And so what you're starting to see is people frustrated that they're having to stack up their Substacks. They're like, well, I love your work, but do I really want to pay for one reporter? From the reporter's side, because this is a two-sided market, the reporter feels like they have to file 3 times a day. just to serve and prove their value to the consumer. So Substack has been an incredible way to prove in my meetings with investors, they agree that it's been a great way to prove that independent journalism is something people will pay for. But we need a system that's better, that is vetted, where effectively, not everybody who can describe themselves as a journalist is necessarily on a platform. And how do you bundle the best of the best? Beyond that, how do you also build better tech? I mean, how do you get young people who are interested in broadcasting, great television, really good videos? And ultimately, we looked at this very closely, and we concluded that an app first has to be the best approach, because so many people, young people, are really getting the vast majority of their news on their phones. And so we took a look at Substack, said, yes, what they have done to date works. We don't think that there's a great longevity in that. We think that there's a better system that needs to be built for journalists in particular. And the tech needs to be better, and it needs to be an app, and it also needs to be a bundle where the journalists are offering a much better value proposition to their subscribers.
Why does it have to be an app?
Because the vast majority of young people are getting most of their news on their phones, effectively not going to their laptops,
But
opening their
aren't they
laptop.
getting it from YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram?
Exactly. But they're looking for a place. Effectively, they have to, because they're doing that, they're having to put in labor. They're having to look for specific stories. Who is this reporter? Do I trust this reporter? Oh, okay, I do love this guy on YouTube, and I do love this one person on TikTok, but they're scattered. What if you could pull those people together into a more premium destination?
But isn't the problem, and I don't mean to be a pain, but this is what
All right.
investors and others try to poke holes into it. The multi-homing problem, they call it, I guess, in business school. You have the New York Times app, you have the YouTube app, you have Instagram, you have some people who are in specific silos. How many different things do I need? If I want to see Chuck Todd, he is
Mm-hmm.
decidedly a newsphere person.
Right.
Oliver Darcy has his newsletter elsewhere. There are other people who are kind of journalism adjacent. And
Mm-hmm.
my impression was that this was all getting sucked into YouTube, the largest channel in the world, to begin with. How do you get your head around YouTube, and how do you convince your your clients to? Well, you still have to divvy up your time and your output between YouTube and this. There still has to be a podcast on Spotify, right? There still has to be an Insta or TikTok thing. It's just so absolutely tiring. And even Substack, I was listening to a podcast a few weeks
Mm-hmm.
ago that now you're encouraged to, Substack has an algorithm and you have to flirt with that algorithm too. It just makes you want to have an aneurysm.
Exactly, which, I would argue is the very reason that building a one home that effectively that real journalism can enter into takes a lot of that labor out of it. I mean, if you're looking to escape an algorithm, but you really have, once a consumer has reached a a critical mass of specific reporters they love in one place, because of the problem you've outlined, they're going to lean into that place. Okay, there's 5 people in here who I do love. Not only am I getting value for money, but I don't have to keep flicking between all these other places. The other thing that we haven't opened in this discussion yet that is
Please
about to
do.
change everything is AI. I mean, the YouTube will be awash with AI generated content. I mean, as will, of course, social media as it's becoming already. I think what's going to become more important in the future is, where can I find content I can trust? Where can I know that effectively this won't be AI generated? That AI is, we're not Luddites, like we love it. We use it to run the company. Journalists can use it as a tool to make their work more efficient. But ultimately, how do I know I'm not watching an AI generated image? That is going to be something that social media, that YouTube, that even Substack is not going to be able to really police for.
Jane, you're really running up against login fatigue, though. I'm sure you hear a lot about that, right? I want to click on something and it's a scoop and there's clickbait or something out there. And I think twice or thrice, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now about it, because there's such a deluge and the stuff is so out there and they're aggregators and platforms. But if it leads to a login thing, you know what the conversion, the ratio thing is. And even among these individual creators, the secessionist movement, they know that dreaded ratio, the people out there that will click and follow versus,
Mm-hmm.
actually harvesting them as a paying subscriber.
100%. But that doesn't it doesn't actually dissuade reporters from doing their work. I mean, effectively, if you think about how many millions of people used to watch the evening news, out of the entire population of the United States, it's still a tiny proportion of people. I mean, ultimately, what matters is that you reach a broad enough audience to make a good living and get your work seen out there. But ultimately, if what you're looking for is, I want to be massively famous and I need millions and millions of views for my work, then the subscription model is not for you. But as a business model right now, it's the one that is best working.
Jane, my mind works metaphorically again, so please forgive me.
That's okay.
But it feels like you go back in the 1950s in these automats in Midtown Manhattan, where you'd buy a piece of pie, you get a thing of sandwich, you drop coins in each one, and it's very coin operated. The part of that bundling, which I mean, I have to say that the cable was the craziest business model ever made, right? You pay them $150 a month for three or four or five channels you wanted, and there wasn't an a la carte option. Now there's this worry that it's becoming way too a la carte, that we're actually
Right.
hoping for somebody to bring them under a tent together. Or I don't know if a Substack or someone could have a prime type package where you could pick five or six or seven creators. It seems like we have to head that way. And by the way, CNN, the others who still want to come down this pike and convince you to pay directly for news, not to have it in some Max or HBO Max app. So many
Well,
apps, so many asks.
what you're describing is Newsphere. I mean, someone will build a home that feels like the best ultimate bundle for reporters to enter effectively. Like how do we basically build the tent for people to enter it? I would argue also that part of this conversation is better tech. Like we took a look at what consumers want. Like you say, there's a lot of watching this and reading that. They want the ability to interact with a journalist too. So what if you did build a tent where not only is everybody in there, but you get to have conversations with those journalists. You get
Isn't Puck
to
isn't Puck doing that? Aren't the more live events Axios, Vox?
There's
I mean, I
live
lost track of
events,
the names.
but live events are not really the same thing. What an individual consumer wants and what they're really sort of telling a lot of researchers is they want to be able to ask a question and without having to show up and sit down at like a classroom. I mean, I'm talking about the ability to jump in, ask a question, and a journalist can answer you. They can answer you on video, they can answer you on audio, a true interaction. This is the ability to host conversations. That's the next real global network. And so, I mean, I just think that we're still working with technology and platforms that were not designed for what the journalists need or what the consumer really wanted from a journalist. We're just squatting in these spaces because we were homeless for a while. And so, yes, I think that live events are great for certain niche consumers who are very focused on business, politics, but ultimately, your average person, if they're really interested in an individual journalist, what they're going to want is more access to that person, not just more content churned out.
Tell me how you pitched Chuck Todd.
Um, Effectively by saying this is an exciting, we're building something exciting and new, like be part of a company rather than just, starting
But
your own.
made by a journalist for a journalist. I mean, I could imagine a LinkedIn featurizing this. I can imagine a specific journalistic tier of Riverside, right? Do you know what I'm saying? There is that
Sure.
appeal, but also that skepticism, and that this is star foreign correspondent Jane Ferguson doing this. She's not, Silicon Valley Jane.
Well, that's nice of you to say. I mean, yes, there's a there's a there's a credibility to journalists saying, listen, I've been in the field for years. I know what we need. I know what our consumers want. And, I'm not a computer scientist and I didn't go to MIT, but I have experience and I have information and knowledge that is absolutely unique. And this, like the future of journalism is not going to be decided by Silicon Valley executives. It's also not going to be decided by media executives of the past. It's reporters who need to be able to build this out themselves. And so, yes, if we're going to build something new, I do think it needs to come from the journalists themselves. And yeah, so talking to Chuck, it's not just like, oh, be terribly impressed by my resume. There's plenty of very impressive journalists out there. But when I describe what we're building, a journalist will know, oh, I understand why that's going to work because I'm a reporter too and I get it. And so it's actually an easier conversation than it is in the investment world or in the tech world and things like that.
I want to close out this interview in the 5 or 6 minutes we have left, Jane, talking about you and specifically what you're built out of, kind of the, building Jane Ferguson, to have had the audacity to have resisted the imposter syndrome, to have, felt the ambrosia of this idea in Princeton and saying that I'm the person to do it. Can you take us back? And it also takes a lot of audacity to go to the destinations that you have. I mean, thinking about Mogadishu, I'm thinking about Afghanistan. Um, and getting on a plane and dealing with the flak jackets and the enormous amount of stress. Where did you come from? I mean, what was the genesis of this?
Well, not to become the person who says you should buy my book, but I did actually write my book to answer that question. Like I got to the end of, I spent about 15 years on the road as mostly conflict reporter, war reporter. And I wanted to answer that question, like, who the hell are we, this weird bunch of people? You know, because it's what makes us tick. And so I did dive into like my childhood, my time growing up in Northern Ireland, among the troubles there, and the wanderlust that I developed being a kid growing up on a farm in the middle of nowhere. Um, and so there were all of these factors that created who I was. But I would say that, you know, one thing that my journalism career taught me was that ultimately I could actually create success out of failure. It sounds hokey and kind of cheesy, but a lot of people looked at my career and were like, "Wow, that's amazing." But I couldn't get a job. That's how I ended up being a foreign correspondent because I graduated from college into the middle of the biggest financial crisis since the 1929. So I got on a plane to Yemen to study Arabic, and that's how my career started. Um, and so
How does one decide? Oh, well, this is I would work at a Starbucks in Mexico City at worst, right? But you got on a plane and went to Yemen, the borderline failed state.
right, and I because what was the other option to like give up on what I wanted to do? Like I didn't want to quit. I just I didn't have I had a force driving me forward, which was that this is all I'd ever wanted to do since I was a little girl. I dreamed of being a foreign correspondent. I couldn't believe it was a real job and people would pay you to fly around the world to go off and document amazing things and people and places. So, so I had to do something. And the truth is, I've been a complete fish out of water my whole life. Like I'm a working class farmer's daughter from Ireland. Like, I ended up traveling around the world. Like, the world of foreign correspondency, it's not a lot of people from the similar background. And so I've always, been very, very good at being an outsider. I end up being a woman reporting in a lot of places where there aren't always a lot of other women, other female reporters, sure, but like, covering militaries and front lines and so, living and working among cultures that are very, very different from where I grew up. So I'm very comfortable being an outsider. I'm also very comfortable being underestimated. It's an incredible it's a real secret weapon. So it's okay for me to be in rooms with people who are relatively skeptical. And the other thing was, whenever this idea struck me and it really touched me, I thought this is what I want to do because I want to fix this. Was you ask yourself, well, what what if I don't do it? I'm going to open the Financial Times someday and find someone else had this idea and saw it through, and I'll be forever mad at myself. So, you know, you don't really risk very much by just going for it because ultimately, if you've decided you wanted to do it, what are what are you leaving behind?
How are these legacy media players going to self disrupt into the world of? You've heard it several times before, like print advertising for every $10 you exchange for 10 cents of online advertising. And up till recently, I think CNN had one of the most visited news sites in the world in the era of laptops and tablets. And now that it's gone to the phone, that is never really going to move the needle on a gigantic company that's being cast off and spun off and has to be responsible for its own P&L. And so you wonder how, in your case, that what was great was when something such as Iran, Israel would happen, you would turn on CNN, they'd have the people, they could go to Amanpour, they could go to a stringer out of the Middle East, someone in Tel Aviv. You could call somebody on a sat phone. Are you able to kind of tap your Rolodex right now and set up something similar to that if something like a Tiananmen would occur? I want you to imagine, say, a 1989 in 2025. If it could be done with something as simple as a
Mhm.
smartphone or a laptop on a cruddy Wi-Fi in Kabul or wherever else you see the next conflagration. You see what I'm saying?
The answer is 100%. There's absolutely no reason that you can't deliver as good a product, like as good a journalist, the broadcast quality. I mean, it's all there. What the monopoly that cable TV had on the reporter, the access, the live feeds, all of that no longer exists. What they're really kind of living off of is a certain degree of polish and really a brand recognition that is still very valuable. But there's absolutely no reason why you couldn't have a very high quality reporter who's in Tehran or in Tel Aviv or in Damascus or wherever, go live to an audience, to break stories, to write articles and publish them. I mean, you're really just talking about distribution models here. And yet, the cable network has overheads that are eye watering, whereas the independent platform or the independent journalist doesn't. So, that's why I just don't believe that a lot of legacy media is going to be able to pivot sharply enough, which would mean stripping down to their studs and rebuilding according to the consumer habits that are proving better in the independent sphere. Like they'd have to strip right down and start rebuilding from the ground up. And I just don't think massive corporations are in a position to do that.
Postscript, Jane, before we sadly say bye to you, is that you had mentioned the troubles, and I'm thinking back to Northern Ireland. Do you know that in our vernacular terms of trade, that's actually what's used to describe the volatility at WNYC and WAMU, the troubles and the troubles part two. And again,
Really?
yeah, if you read the news again today, again, the CEO of WNYC steps down. This is just something that you've seen it in waves and waves and waves and lower lows and lower highs coming out of the cycles. And it's just been, in my 25 years in the industry, it's just been inexorable. And it's
Mm.
really hard if you're a journalist and it's not for the pay to begin with to say, this is the time to self disrupt. But as you flick that, there is a particular liberation or freedom or exhilaration to say I really have nothing to lose at this point by doing it.
And what's baked into that is an acceptance. I think that has been the difference for a long time in 2022, 2023. I felt like I was a bit of a prophet wandering in the desert. Like, and people would be like, oh, you're so pessimistic, Jane. Like, come on, like legacy media is not going to die. Those conversations have changed in the last 12 to 18 months, where there is a sense that this is an existential crisis, an extinction event. I think I read someone use
Yeah.
that phrase. And so it comes down to acceptance. And that's when people begin to acceptance that this is terminal. Then they're going to be more open to much more radical change. And I think part of that is going to be those who are striking out first, taking risks, trying new things. If we can like prove that something else is working, it inspires others to also try as well, completely different models.
Jane Ferguson, she is CEO and founder of Newsphere. It's a monetization app based platform for journalists wanting to go straight to their subscribers and loyal readers. The book is No Ordinary Assignment, a memoir. It's something you can't put down, as is with your body of work for The New Yorker. We both had PBS NewsHour in common as special correspondents. Gosh, you've been in Syria, Mosul, Kabul, Yemen. I hope you make it to Iran, and maybe
I
we
do
can use your
too.
golden passport. If nothing else, I've always said if we open a Chipotle in Tehran, we'd win a Nobel Prize, we'd become billionaires, and we'd bring two great civilizations back together. But I need your passport
I
protection
think
first.
Iranian food is just fine as it is. Thank you.
Next time you're in DC, I'll take you out for great Persian food. Thank
I
you.
would love
Thank you for joining us and for coming on our 2 kilobit platform. I hope to do something on Newsphere.
that. We'd love to have you.
Thank you.